Recently you wrote the following, quote, "The failures, real and perceived, of the Bush administration hang over the Republican Party like a dark cloud, and the failure to deal openly and honestly with the past could hobble the GOP for years." The failures, real and perceived, of the Bush administration probably begin with foreign policy, although there are things to be said on the domestic side too. Looking at the foreign policy of George W. Bush and his successor, first of all, which style of American foreign policy are we seeing here? Are these Wilsonians? Was George W. Bush a Wilsonian, or was he something else?
Well, I think Bush was elected as something of a Jeffersonian. He said we have to pay more attention to things at home. In fact, you look at Bush before 9/11, there's a lot of Obama in that. Mm-hmm. We've gotten too involved in these big projects.
No nation building.
Right. We need to be humbler, those kinds of things. Then after 9/11, I think he becomes Jacksonian, as I think any president would have needed to do to some degree. But then, and so the invasion of Iraq was presented as a Jacksonian. They got weapons of mass destruction coming from for you. And that made a lot of people in the country believe, and I don't think he lied. That is not what but that this was a Jacksonian war of self-defense. Right. Now, when the weapons didn't turn up and we were still stuck in a war, he became Wilsonian, and suddenly we were fighting to build democracy in Iraq, and this is, a noble thing to try to do, and so on and so forth. But you got into a situation where most of the Wilsonians in America at that time, except for a fairly small number of neoconservatives, most of the Wilsonians were now against the Iraq War, yes. But it was being fought for democracy. And the people who were really in favor of the Iraq War, not so much, no one was in favor, but don't want to lose the war and want the president to do whatever it takes to win, were basically Jacksonians who at that point were saying, it might be a mistake to be in Iraq, but losing a war, you can't just send a war back. Waiter, I don't like this war. Go bring me something else. This is not what I ordered. So, in that sense, he was conducting a Wilsonian policy from a Jacksonian base, and it was not a great move. But fortunately for him and the country, I think the Jacksonian base and its determination not to gratuitously lose a war enabled us to stay at it, and he was able to do the surge.
And it would be fair to say that you supported him?
I supported
for those very reasons, basically.
Once we were
Jacksonian.
I believed Colin Powell when he said at the UN that there were weapons of mass destruction. It was a gun at our head. Okay. Then once we were in the war, I certainly felt that, oops, but you can't stop. You can't, you can't just, and I, even talking to sort of very liberal anti-war friends, I said, well, do you really think we can just walk away now? People would say, no, we can't, but they didn't want to sort of take the burden of saying that in public. I also disagreed with the people who thought the war was just lost, that it seemed to me that it was still possible to get not some beautiful democracy in Iraq, but something approaching an order. And I think we had it for a while, and I think it could have stayed. But in any case, even at the time I felt that people will be studying the run-up to the Iraq War for 100 years as an example of how not to lead the United States to war. Because intentionally or not, they created the impression that they wanted the war. Look back at, say, the Civil War. How hard did Abraham Lincoln work to make sure that Jefferson Davis fired the first shot? All right, you could have. Let's assume that you accept the case we need to have a war with Iraq, for whatever reason. I think what you do then, I think it's legal, I think it works better in a lot of ways. You say, look, Saddam Hussein, we have a ceasefire agreement and you're breaking 100 clauses. One of them is that you're not letting UN weapons inspectors in to verify this, but you're breaking all these others. And here's the thing about a ceasefire. We don't have a state of peace. We're actually at war, interrupted, a UN-blessed war, by the way, interrupted by this ceasefire, which you're in violation of. We are going to begin enforcing this ceasefire. We're going to enforce it peacefully. We're not firing any shots. We are maintaining peace. We are not making war. And then I think and this...
He was firing on our overflights.
Well, again, I think...
After all, yeah, I mean, he was really breaking the ceasefire.
You get him in an here's Fort Sumter and you've shot at it. And then I think you've got a different base. Part of the thing that made the Iraq War such a terrible political disaster for the Republican Party is that Bush, the administration, allowed the public perception of the case to be, we are going to war for weapons of mass destruction. It was the most humiliating fiasco in the history of the United States to lead the country to, oops, never mind. It's ridiculous. It's horrible statesmanship. And that comes from somebody who loyally stuck by and supported the darn war all those years.
How important was that foreign policy failure to Obama's election?
Oh, I don't think Barack Obama could have become president of the United States without the Iraq War. I think the Iraq War helped revive the American left. I think it drove the Democratic Party significantly to the left, and I think it disenchanted the combination of the Iraq War and the very poor record of accomplishment in domestic policy of the administration, ending, let's not forget, with the worst financial crisis since the Depression. All right. Gave an entire age cohort of Americans a negative impression about Republican competence and reliability. And it will take time to efface that in any case.
Now, Pete Wehner says you're exaggerating the negatives in the Bush record, domestically and foreign.
I'm talking,
policy.
Again, I say real and perceived.
Yeah.
And that's, again, even if what they were was strategic geniuses, but they were, strategic PR idiots, that still adds up to incompetence. If you take a country that has been moving toward the center right for a number of years, and you basically bring an end to the Reagan era in American history, and then you want to tell everybody what a political genius you are, I can't help you make that case.
Yes.
I am not trying. I don't want to. I don't think that Bush had bad intentions. I don't think everything that administration did was wrong. I, even think there is, on the terms I've explained, a case for an Iraq war. And as I say, I certainly continue to support what they did. I admire his courage at the surge. All of those things. I'm not trying to come in here and just, trash everybody. And furthermore, I think only a really very small number of senior people made the decisions. And, you have a lot of people who were in the administration in sort of the second-tier types of positions. That's where the natural leadership of the future of the Republican Party, especially in foreign policy, is. And it's part of why I think those people Republicans need to say, and former Bush people need to say, not in an ugly or disrespectful or negative way, but they need to talk about, so what did we learn from what happened in those years? How am I more capable now to provide America with leadership and governance after this experience than I was before this experience? People need to hear that. And if when you try to open that conversation, people say, oh, you're just, you're saying these terrible things, that's shutting down a conversation that I think will heal, not hurt. on the right.
And finally, how do you rate the Obama administration's foreign policy so far?
Mix, it's a little bit like what is it, Show and Lie supposed to have said about the French Revolution, too soon to tell. But I think they had a mix of some very good and some very bad ideas. The very good ideas were that the United States probably needed to find ways to reduce its profile in the Middle East where possible, to do what we could to cool the white heat of intensity that people had coming out of the Bush years about the United States in that part of the world, and also shift energy to Asia, where really the future of American foreign policy is likely to be. But I think they, and so at the level, what you might call a grand strategy, that's not a bad grand strategy. In some ways it looks even better now than it did before, not because of anything they did, but the discovery of all this new oil reserves that we can get in America and so on underlines the case that, maybe we don't have to be on quite such a trigger finger about everything in the Middle East. However, you get some big problems with the execution. And in the same way, I think Bush had basically a good grand strategy. I think there were flaws of execution. And in the Obama case, I think one of the things is they overestimated their success in dealing with the jihadi movement. Because it's certainly true, and thankfully true, that Al-Qaeda as an organization has been substantially reduced in what it can do. But the sort of Al-Qaeda brand,
right,
and beyond that, the kind of jihadi movement has metastasized in some ways. And it's actually, and you can say, as President Obama did recently, that we don't face the same kind of organized threat. It's true, but the other kind of threat can be equally dangerous and much harder to deal with.
It was extraordinary to pronounce that speech of Obama's, that pronounced that the war on terror is over, essentially, when
right,
the other side has not stopped fighting.
Right. Well, now, the good news there is President Obama is a political calculator, and he does look at the intelligence reports. He wouldn't say that if he was seriously worried himself that a big 9/11 style thing was even remotely possible tomorrow. I mean, I think we can just, he's not that big of a fool, I don't think. But I think that, the idea that, the jihadis are now in some ways more in the mainstream in the Middle East than they were in the past. They're still a minority, they're still a fringe. But with the Sunni-Shia war that is picking up, they're actually, there are a lot of...
This is the war not just within Iraq, but
in
especially
Syria and Lebanon, right, and this sort of
that
spreading...
of...
right. And some people in America saying, fine, let's let them kill each other. Hopefully they'll get each other.
It's like Kissinger's famous remark about the Iraq-Iran war. It's a shame that both can't lose.
Right.
Yeah.
But, you'll notice that neither Iran nor Iraq has been like a bright spot for American foreign policy since that war. So sitting back and hoping they'll kill each other is not actually a policy.
Right.
And what's happened is that in the Gulf, a lot of very rich people are sending money. The financial links between the jihadi movement and the wealthy Arabs have been renewed. It's become respectable again to have dealings with some of these people. The bright line we were trying to draw between the people who are trying to kill us and the others has been eroded. And this is going to draw and train a whole new generation of cadres of terrorists who will be hardened. You're going to have the Middle East filled with tens of thousands of young men who are trained at war and have no other trade, no other way to make a living, and whose only education is in radical ideology. This is not a success. And to sort of in the midst of this say, thank goodness we don't have to worry about that dreadful war anymore, is probably not the wisest thing someone could do. And again, the problem is that in the Middle East, the jihadis have adapted to what we were doing and doing very successfully, so that they have rekindled and are regenerated. In Asia, China's response to the pivot to Asia, I think, was more negative than the administration had expected. And China is pushing harder and testing more. And I think this means that both in the Middle East and Asia, we now are, we've written checks we can't cover easily. And the administration has a defense budget which is predicated on a rapid downturn of American expenses and presence abroad. But I think it has a policy which actually has us facing significantly great, right. The policy's at odds with the budget. That's a problem.
It's the classic Hamiltonian problem of willing the ends but not being prepared to will the means to those ends.
So I think they're in trouble on this. I don't know how it will work out. Again, Democrats do have one advantage, which is the press doesn't like to attack them, and if it does attack them, it attacks them only from the left. And since the election, when the press didn't have to worry about getting a Republican elected, there's been a very, very noticeable uptick in attacks on Obama's drone policy and so on from the left.
And since Mrs. Clinton left the administration, all of the foreign policy people connected to her and to her husband are a little bit freer to criticize the president as well.
I think it's probably just as well for the president that Richard Holbrooke isn't alive to write his memoirs. So yes, I think it's going to be it's a more difficult situation. That said, there's not a groundswell of support in America for invading some more Middle Eastern countries or, doing much of anything. The Jacksonians, again, I think this is part of the price for what happened in Iraq and so on. The Jacksonians are now kind of fed up to some degree with foreign policy as a whole.
Right.
And yeah, they're focused on terrorism and drones and so on. Last I looked, by the way, drones have a higher approval rating among the American people than the president and Congress combined. And so, killing bad people
they're more effective than the president and the Congress combined.
Well, I mean, the president does, have something to do with the drones.
Of course.
But anyway, and I think the president's smart enough to understand that that's the sweet spot for his policy. A tough line on drones, and to some degree, the more Glenn Greenwald and the left attack the president on drones, that just reinforces him. It's like, good, please attack me some more to some degree. So there you have it. And the American people are not, the Jacksonians are disillusioned. The Wilsonians are discouraged, I think. We had this, the president did fight one humanitarian war in Libya when he was led from behind into Libya. I think it was a huge mistake. I think the energy that went into that intervention should have gone into Syria. In some ways, Syria has the strategic importance, and it's also a much bigger humanitarian issue. The stakes at Syria were much higher. If he'd led from behind in Syria and ignored Libya, I actually think that would have been a much, much stronger policy. And to some degree,
with no-fly zones, you mean, and arming
the
rebels.
The details, I think we'd have to talk. But generically speaking, leading from behind, letting the British and the French and others take more of the lead, applying American force with the lightest touch compatible with the results that you want, but also trying to foreclose. The Syrian war needed to end early. Every day it goes on, people are more bitter. The jihadis are in there. The Russians and the Iranians are making more trouble. Israel's likelihood of war with Hezbollah, it just all gets worse every day. And doing all of this a year ago, 15 months ago or something, We don't know what would have happened, and it wouldn't have been pretty. Let's not say that. But also, Syria is important enough to us and to the world that there would have been some kind of commitment to at least try to get some sort of post-war arrangement there. So I think what we did was we frivolously and lightly intervened in a war where we really didn't have that much of a stake, and where even the humanitarian issues, though real, were small. And as a result, partly, we find ourselves paralyzed when something really important is on the table.
Thank you, Walter Russell Mead, for joining us on The American Mind.
Thank you.